If the world cannot respect Africa standing tall, then we will no longer kneel to be seen.
Those were the first words President Ibrahim Traoré spoke as he stepped up to the podium, the United Nations General Assembly. No greetings, no pleasantries, no smiles, just that sentence sharp, unapologetic, and heavy enough to shift the air in the room. Diplomats froze mid-breath. Translation headsets went quiet, as if even the machines paused to process what they had just heard. And in that one moment, it became clear this was not going to be a typical speech. This was going to be a reckoning. The chamber, built to impress with its polished wood, grand flags, and marble silence, had never felt smaller. Delegates from Europe and North America glanced at one another. Some reached for pens, others reached for spin. But Traoré didn't wait for their reactions. He continued. You speak of development as if we were not first made poor. You speak of stability as if you did not arm our chaos. You demand reforms, yet write none for yourselves. You shake our hands while clutching the contracts you wrote before we could read. A few whispered among themselves. Some shifted in their seats, visibly uncomfortable, but no one interrupted. They couldn't. His voice was calm, but his words came like thunder. For 500 years, Africa has not been asked to speak. We've been told to smile. We were not asked to let, we're asked to obey. You invited us to this assembly, but only so we could be lectured in your language, measured by your standards, and dismissed by your decisions. But today, we speak without fear. He wasn't reading from a paper. No teleprompter blinked in front of him. Every word seemed carved into his chest long before he said it. Every line sounded like something he had carried on his back since boyhood, and now he was unloading it not as anger, but as truth long denied. Traoré did not raise his voice, but the room seemed to grow louder with every sentence. You find wars in our soil, then sell us peace talks. You impose sanctions, then sell us wheat. You call us unstable, while your corporations strip our land for lithium and gold. He took a long pause. We do not ask for pity. We demand partnership or we walk. Some in the chamber tried to pretend it was just another speech from a frustrated leader, but those who were listening, truly listening, understood. This was different. This was not a request for help. It was an announcement of independence. The speech lasted 8 minutes. No metaphors, no quotes from Western philosophers, no rehearsed gestures, just a mirror held up to the world. And when it was over, Traoré stepped down. But instead of returning to his seat, he walked out. Silence followed. Delegates turned to each other, unsure if they had just witnessed a walkout or a declaration. Reporters scrambled for their cameras. Social media exploded. Within 15 minutes, the hashtag #TraoréWalks was trending in over 40 countries. In the streets of Nairobi, university students blasted the clip on loudspeakers, chanting, "Africa doesn't kneel." In Accra, school teachers posted their lessons and replayed his words. In Lagos, a mural was painted overnight. Traoré walking away from the podium, with the caption, "Respect isn't requested, it's reclaimed." But the real shock came not from the speech, nor from the walkout, but from what happened next. Back inside the UN chamber, after Traoré's silent exit, there was no applause, no official closing remarks, only a deep, uneasy stillness. The Secretary General shifted in his seat, clearly rattled. The usual diplomatic rhythm, polite nods, scripted condemnations, subtle, arrogant cues gone. It had been ruptured by something raw, something real. By the next morning, Traoré's words had become more than a speech. They had become a signal. In Paris, commentators called it defiant populism. In Washington, White House aides privately panicked. And in London, an emergency press conference was held to reaffirm the UK's commitment to African partnership. But it was too late. Africa had heard him, and more importantly, the youth of Africa had believed him. Traoré returned to Burkina Faso the following day to a scene no one could have scripted. Tens of thousands had filled the streets of Ouagadougou, not with rage, but with resolve. Mothers with children on their backs, fathers raising faded independence flags, teenagers holding cardboard signs with hand-painted words. Traoré spoke for us. We are no one's puppet. The mask has fallen. But this wasn't just a celebration. It was the beginning of something deeper. In Accra, university professors held open lectures dissecting every line of Traoré's speech. In Dar es Salaam, civil rights lawyers gathered to file a joint declaration demanding the UN revise how African nations are represented in Security Council votes. And in Bamako, a group of young engineers launched a Pan-African tech coalition inspired by Traoré's challenge to dependence on Western systems. Traoré himself said little. He appeared only once at the National Assembly to say this: "Do not confuse silence with retreat. The storm is quiet before it breaks." And break it did. 3 days after the speech, a leaked diplomatic cable revealed that several Western countries had already begun pushing for economic retaliation against Burkina Faso. Threats of sanctions, suspended delays in trade agreements. The message was clear: speak out, and we will squeeze you. But this time, the continent did not scatter, it closed ranks. Within 48 hours, Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Chad signed a joint declaration refusing to recognize any economic sanctions levied against Burkina Faso. Soon after, Ghana, Tanzania, and even South Africa added their support. The African Union was forced to convene an emergency summit. And while the media framed it as a crisis, those attending the summit called it something else entirely: the beginning. What began as one man's truth spoken at a podium had become a wildfire of solidarity and a crisis for those who had always relied on Africa remaining divided, dependent, and voiceless. The G7 nations, realizing the moment was slipping from their hands, scrambled to take control of the narrative. They began inviting moderate African leaders for behind-the-scenes diplomacy, but even those who once would have played along now found themselves under pressure back home, not from foreign governments, but from their own people. Traoré had changed the temperature. In one viral video, a 14-year-old Kenyan girl was interviewed on the street holding a printed transcript of his speech. When asked what she admired about Traoré, she didn't even blink. Because he wasn't scared. Because he didn't ask, he told them. That clip was played on national television in over a dozen countries. Meanwhile, inside Western boardrooms, something else was happening, something quiet, but far more consequential. Investors began asking questions. What if Africa pulled out of our deals? What if these new alliances mean we lose lithium control? What happens if African leaders stop needing us to build their infrastructure? Traoré hadn't just spoken to the UN. He had spoken to the financial arteries of the global north, and those arteries had started to twitch. In the weeks that followed, the world watched with unease as a new axis began to form. It built on military pacts or secret handshakes, but on shared scars and remembered betrayal. Burkina Faso became a symbol, but Traoré refused to let it become a pedestal. "This is not the age of messiahs," he said in one televised address. "This is the age of waking up." At the African Union's emergency summit in Addis Ababa, something happened that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. 47 of 55 African nations agreed to adopt a unified foreign policy charter, a direct response to centuries of being divided by borders others had drawn. That charter called for continent-wide resource control, tech collaboration, and a 5-year transition plan away from dependence on Western currency systems. But perhaps more jarring than the signatures was who wrote the charter's opening lines. "We have spoken in the chambers of those who once dictated our silence. We now speak to ourselves. And in this, we are not alone, we are free." Traoré, once dismissed by Western pundits as just another populist soldier in fatigues, had become the first leader in a generation to inspire not fear or obedience but unfiltered unity, not in slogans, not in tweets, in action. Across the Atlantic, attempts were made to minimize his influence. News cycles shifted. Editorials questioned his credibility. Intelligence agencies whispered about destabilization, but no one could deny what was already unfolding: a rebalancing of global consciousness, rooted not in vengeance but in memory, justice, and self-respect. And still, Traoré refused to become the story. When asked by a journalist if he saw himself as a revolutionary, his answer was simple: "I see myself as a mirror. If you don't like what you see, it's not me you fear, it's your reflection." That quote was spray-painted across university walls in Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, Cairo. Then came the final twist no one expected. At the next session of the United Nations General Assembly, barely a year after his historic speech, Traoré returned. But this time, he wasn't alone. He walked in flanked by 4 other African heads of state, was greeted with a standing ovation from delegations outside of Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, indigenous representatives from Canada and Australia. The global south had arrived not as beggars, but as builders. When Traoré stepped to the microphone, the room leaned in, cameras clicked, world leaders held their breath. And he said this: When I stood here last, I stood as one. Today I speak as many. And tomorrow, if we are wise, we will speak as all. There was no need for fire this time, no shaking fists. The silence that followed carried more weight than thunder. It was the sound of reckoning, of recognition, of the old world finally seeing itself fade in the new one, uninvited but unrelenting, rising from the dust with dignity. As the assembly adjourned, no one rushed for the exits. No one rolled their eyes. Even those who had once scoffed now nodded slowly, almost reverently. The truth, when spoken with courage, has a strange way of reshaping rooms. And as the screen faded to black on news broadcasts around the world, one caption remained in bold letters. Traoré changed the conversation. Africa changed the world.